At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Hey folks, Dr. Doug here with Dr. Doug and Friends Radio. Thanks for joining us today. And I'm pleased to have Ben Winter on the show with us today. Ben, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Ben, you have done a lot of things. And as I've looked at your website, you've got a business website that you're doing. We're going to talk about a book that you wrote called What to Expect When Having Expectations, and really talk about that and communication and so forth. But tell the audience a little bit about who you are and why you even wrote this book.
Yeah, so I'm a general guy. Like I'm out there living life, trying to, make some difference in the world. And part of that difference is writing this book, and how it came to be is a very long road, but it started with improv, learning improv, doing improv, and then I started teaching improv. And then through the process of teaching improv, I kept stumbling across this point in the teachings where it's all about expectations, and just sort of dove headfirst into that, because I was like, if the only reason people get upset is because expectations haven't been met, then now I have to solve that. Because that's just how my mind works. I've got to be able to solve things that come up for me. So that's where that kind of exploration went, is figuring out how to solve that point in time of being upset about an expectation going unmet, and moving it through the process until you're kind of at a point of peace. And once I solved that, it just became evident that I needed to write a book about it. So
that's right. Well, it sounds like you have a very analytical mind, which is great. And you find something, and then you're going to research that out and figure it out, which is really fantastic. And I think in today's environment, this expectation situation has really started to have an effect on us in many positive ways, but also in some many negative ways. What do you find is the source of our expectations, if there is a source, and let's talk about that for a minute, and then talk about good expectations, bad expectations.
Absolutely. And I think you kind of hit it dead on with society today. And, in society today, people will fight each other based on their expectations of how the world's supposed to be. And where that comes from is when we're growing up. We grow up in a home with a family, or we don't live in a home, whatever it may be. How we grow up is how we perceive the world to be. And if we're not willing to educate ourselves and grow as people as we move through life, then that's what our world is. So if you grow up in a house where everybody loves everybody, and you're just open and welcoming to everyone around you, then that's your world as you grow up as an adult. If you grow up in a house where you hate certain people because of what they think, what they look like, and you grow up without deciding to educate yourself, then you grow up wanting to hate those people. And so that's kind of the quick premise of where our expectations come from, is how we're raised as kids.
Well, and I think that's very true. I saw an interesting movie on YouTube. I think it was on, or it may have been on Netflix, talking about social media and how that literally has started to affect people's thought process and expectations. And I don't know if you've ever seen that or talked about that at all, but how much do you think social media is affecting and actually creating our expectations to some degree? Because I've met some people, and I've known some people who really have grown up in a very interesting, good, what we would call a good environment, good expectations, and all of a sudden social media has hit them, and I have watched them actually move their expectations over one way or the other, to the degree that it has really dramatically changed who they are from that perspective. What are your thoughts on the social media part of that?
To some extent, social media just enforces our thoughts and beliefs. If you want to believe something, there is plenty of information out there to prove that you're right. And unfortunately, like, I grew up watching a very specific news station as a kid because that's what my parents put on. So what do I watch as an adult? I watch the same news station. Of course, I don't watch news anymore, but if I did, I would watch the same station
Right.
because that's what I grew up with. I'm like, this must be the superior news station because that's what my parents watched. And so, some people will grow up or spend their adult life, they'll stumble across some news program on cable and they'll decide, you know what, this kind of resonates with me, and they'll stick with it. And as time goes on, as the years go by, you've bought into that this news station speaks to you as you see the world around you. And so when that news station, left or right, doesn't matter, when they start lying to you about what's happening in the world, you start to believe it. And then you go to social media and you continually get the same information because that's the reality that you have bought into. And nobody wants to be wrong. And so they're going to fight everybody who tells them that they're wrong. Well, no, you're watching the wrong news. No, you're watching the wrong news. And everybody's just, butting heads. And it's a never ending battle. And until somebody says, you know what, maybe instead of watching a news station out here on the fringe, maybe I actually get real truthful news, which is honestly harder to find nowadays.
Yeah.
Because, with social media, with all the outlets, if you want to be right about what you believe, you're going to go there. And that's where the advertising dollars go. And so those programs spend more and more money to keep you with them, to keep you in that reality that you think is real. And so that's unfortunate. And I don't see it like getting better. It's just kind of a downward spiral, and I don't know what's going to happen when we hit rock bottom.
That makes it tough, and one of the things I found interesting is I've interviewed different people, some of the concepts that have come up, particularly about relationships and obviously how important relationships are. And since COVID, divorce rates have skyrocketed, according to the divorce attorneys. and as I've thought about that, and that happens to be family culture and family health is really an important part of what I look to be able to help with. And when we talk about expectations, I'd really be interested in your viewpoint on this. So here we are as a couple with maybe a couple of children, and the kids are going to school and the husband's going to work, maybe the wife's going to work, depending on how that all works. And all of a sudden, you're all at home and everybody's remoting from home, and you're spending time with each other more than you ever anticipated. And all of a sudden, you're starting to see conflict and challenges in those relationships that normally you've never experienced. And I think to some degree, it probably has something to do with the fear and the anxiety relative around COVID. But beyond that, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that suddenly they're together all of the time. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about where expectations fit into that and how that can be actually causing some of these challenges that they're facing as a family and their family culture.
Absolutely. Relationships are probably the biggest point of contention when it comes to expectations and getting upset. We live with people, so we just assume that they know our thoughts and what's going on in our heads. But they don't. And a lot of times when we get upset, we didn't even know that we had the expectation that is going unmet at the moment. And so it's really unfair to kind of put that on somebody else, to say, hey, you're not following through on my expectation that I didn't even know I had, and I never communicated with you, so it's your fault. Well, it's you have to look inward first and say, I didn't even know I had this expectation. So let's stop for a second and say, you know what, now that I know I have this expectation, let me think about it. Let me kind of explore it. Is it a reasonable expectation? Is it something I need to communicate and, get buy-in from the person sitting across the table from me? And, you throw a bunch of people who have, a family of 4, the number of expectations just exponentially explodes at that point. You're at home, you have a job to do remotely. What do you expect? Do you expect everyone else to be quiet and let you do your work? And, if there's not a lot of space around, that can be really hard if you have kids. And now you have to teach your kids from home and help them get on Zoom and help them get into class. And you're now their stopwatch and timer. And, you're playing secretary and you're also doing your job. Like there's so many things going on that we never expected to have to do. I mean, that's one expectation right there. We never expected to be in a world with a pandemic that's going to just change our lives fundamentally forever. And so there's so many expectations that we didn't even know we had because we've never been through this kind of experience before. And so when you have this family dynamic and everybody has these expectations they didn't even know they had, well, it's a lot easier just to start butting heads and yelling at each other. It's a lot harder to sit down and take personal responsibility and say, I just found out something new about myself. I just found out this is what I think in this situation. And you know what? It's now my job to communicate that with you. We live in a technologically wonderful society where we can send texts and emails and all this stuff, but we suck at communicating. We have gotten so bad at it. And all it takes is a little bit of a discussion to say, hey, when I'm working from home, this is what I hope to have. And then they can say, well, this is what I hope to have. And we also have the children to deal with, and we also have dinner and lunch and all these things. So maybe we come up with a plan and a timetable, and everybody gets what they want, but they get it throughout the day in little spurts. We got to negotiate at that point.
Okay, so you're very analytical. I'm very analytical. If something happens like that, it's like, okay, I had an expectation, but guess what? That really isn't necessarily common and universal in people's abilities to suddenly realize, oh, this whole conflict is caused by my expectation or their expectation. How do you suggest we help people, number one, to be able to get to the point where when they start to see conflict occurring, they immediately start to do that introspective work and say, all right, was this caused by an expectation from me or an expectation from you? And how do you get them to that point of awareness, at least where they can start a conversation? Obviously, we can talk about the importance of communication, and I want to get into that with you. But how do you get them to the point where they're even aware?
I mean, that's the trick, is people need to want to be aware before they can be aware. Just like anybody who's ever had an addiction, a problem, depression, whatever it may be, until they realize that they have the issue, they're not going to do anything about it. And once they know about it, then they want to have to do something different. So if they're in a household where they actually want things to be better, then they're going to start looking for these moments in time where they can.
Okay, so in a family situation, and even outside in any relationships, if you start to observe conflict, is it fair to say, based on your work, that there are some expectations here that are not quite working out and correlating with each other? Is that the first step to just the fact that we're observing conflict?
Yeah. So, we live in a society where everybody says, don't get upset, don't get angry, don't, whatever. I'm like, go ahead, get upset, because you know what? That's a great moment in time to realize that there's a possibility for growth. But again, if you only if you want it, because some people will get upset and they'll stay there. They'll stay there for days, weeks, months, years, forever. What I'm asking people to do is take that moment when you're upset and say, aha, I can do something about this now. Part of my process of kind of figuring everything out was I created this flow chart where the very first point in time at the top of the flow chart is you're upset. And, the first question is, did you know you had this expectation? And that just starts the process of the flow chart. Now, again, that's a very analytical way to look at it, as you say.
No, but let's look at that. That sounds really interesting. Let's go through that a little bit as far as your flow chart goes.
Sure. So, the first question is, did you know you had the expectation? And I would say 90% of the time we don't know that we had one. And so you got to follow through the process on that flow chart. And, at first you have to explore it. And honestly, right there, if you didn't even know you had the expectation, you can just calm down immediately, because now you have to explore it. Say, where did that expectation come from? You know, why do I have it? Is it reasonable? You know, I get upset in traffic. Is it reasonable for me to have an expectation of everybody else driving the same way I do? Absolutely not. So I immediately just calm down and say, they're not me. They didn't have the same student driver I did. They didn't have the same parents. They didn't have the same cars. Like, they didn't have the same mentality. It is completely unreasonable for me to think about other people and their driving, and get upset about it. So I don't get upset at traffic nearly as much as I used to. I mean, I would throw my fist into the other chair, and I was super angry. But you know, that if it's not reasonable, you kind of have to take that moment in time to just kind of talk yourself through it and say, why do I think this way? Like, where did this come from? You know, was this something my parents did? Or maybe I grew up in a town where there, you know, was less than 500,000 people, and now there's 3 million, and the town hasn't grown as fast, you know, whatever it might be. Okay, I'm used to driving in less traffic growing up, and so that's my expectation. But you know, there's more people on the planet. So you know, you just kind of work through this process, and you know, maybe you did know you had the expectation. And you know, the question then is, did you communicate that expectation? Because if you didn't communicate it with the person or people involved, then you know, shame on you. You didn't do your part. Yeah.
Well, and then we get into communication. And I think,
Yeah.
you know, from what I've seen with your book and obviously, you know, all of our experiences, communication becomes the key.
It really is.
So any guidelines for someone on how they can communicate in a non-confrontational way what their expectations are, or be able to ask someone else what their expectations are and get into that conversation where you can take away the emotion from it a bit and really be able to communicate in a way that isn't triggering each other and is really being a positive type of communication of understanding.
Yeah. So I'm going to use an example as a great way to kind of illustrate this. So we'll go back to the house. You know, NFL just came back on. I'm not going to use NFL. Sports ball came back on TV. Okay. Sports ball came back on TV, and you know, the husband is like desperate to watch some games. So he's sitting down. It's a lovely Sunday. He's watching games and he's having a good time. The wife's in the kitchen making food, whatever. She says, honey, please take out the trash. And he's like, okay. Now he may have every intention of taking out the trash when sports ball is done, whatever it may be. She expected him to get up at that moment and take out the trash, but she never said that. And, you know, so we have this kind of escalating moment in time. He doesn't know it's escalating. She's getting more furious as time goes on. And here we are, you know, an hour later, and they're in a yelling match. Well, how could this have played out differently with communication? So when she said, take out the trash, he had the opportunity to ask questions to get clarification on her request, because she didn't say when. She didn't say, you know, why she needed it now as opposed to later. He also didn't, you know, negotiate in the process and say, hey, I'm watching the game. Can I do it in an hour? And, you know, at the same point, she didn't say, you know, if she had come out with more information at the beginning, honey, I need you to take out the trash now because I just threw fish in there and we have company coming over later and I don't want the house to smell. Okay, well, that's a pretty good why. And you know, pretty obvious that it needs to be taken care of immediately. And he may say, okay, it's 2 minutes till halftime, so I'll do it in 2 minutes, whatever that may be. So now they've communicated, they've negotiated. Now, to make it easier for people to communicate, asking questions of somebody else's expectations is a very easy way to do it, as long as you're not being patronizing. If you really truly want clarification on their request, then that's perfectly okay to ask those questions. And sometimes it's scary to share our expectations. You know, you start getting into the more personal things like bedroom activities, and yeah, people are going to be a little bit more afraid to share what they want, because what if what you say becomes that deal breaker, that thing that ruins the relationship? um, Unfortunately, we're in a society where we're too afraid to share our deepest, most intimate things with the person in our house that we married or we're dating or whatever. And what if by sharing that expectation, you actually have a better relationship? What if just sharing that expectation created some dialogue and you actually come up with something in the middle? Who knows what those conversations will lead to. But I think it's just important to start having those conversations, to start adding those points of clarification, just because the more we get out there, the more our expectations are on the table, the more we can negotiate those expectations. Or, you may have an expectation that person's like, I'm totally game. There's no negotiating. But sometimes there is negotiating, and it's just a matter of getting it out there, more or less.
Well, and I think you have a really good point. And I look at I've had some conversations with some folks that really struggle with their teenage kids right now, particularly with online school and not being able to get out with their friends and so forth. and I'm just curious as to how many of us as parents ever take the time to really understand the expectations of our children. Because if we truly begin to understand that and somehow support them in that in one way or the other, I would think that could make a real big difference for our kids.
I mean, I have an 11-year-old. He'll be 12 in August. So I'm looking forward to the teenage years, honestly, because that's going to be the test of how I've parented to date. But I think you're kind of halfway there. I think parents and teenagers absolutely need to share expectations of one another, because I don't know what it's like to be a teenager in this time and age. I didn't have the technology we have today. So for me to assume what my child is going to want as a teenager it's asinine. He is the child living in this world. I didn't grow up with cell phones. I have no clue. Okay, so I don't know what's going on. I didn't grow up with social media in high school. Like, it's not a thing I had to deal with. So it is vitally important for me to pull out the expectations of my child as he grows and grows and grows. And it's vital for me to share my expectations of my son. And I think part of it is teaching our kids what an expectation is, how to understand it, and to really kind of work through, is it a reasonable expectation or not? Because, you think about the different things. If you post something on social media, is it reasonable to expect that everybody's going to be civil about it? Absolutely not. We know today that there are kids that bully through social media. So if you post something on social media, you need to expect that somebody's going to try and push your buttons. You need to expect that if you put something out there that you don't want seen in 10, 20 years, don't put it out there. More and more today, what you post as social media in high school and college can come back to haunt you. I mean, there's plenty of news stories about it. So it's kind of one of those scary times as a parent, because you're like, I get what you're doing as a kid. You want to be a rebel. You want to try things out. But you know what? Some of these things will come back and bite you. So do your best, and I think that's where the expectations and the constant communication has to come in. And I think as long as our kids know we care, that might be all that we can do. But I don't know. I haven't had a teenager yet. I'll let you know in a few years.
I've had 4. So yeah, you're going to have some fun. I can tell you that. So here's the interesting thing. We all have expectations. And I would assume to some degree that some expectations are really good, because as we set expectations for ourselves, for the direction we want to go for potential success and happiness and all of those type of things in life, those are good. And yet, as we know, there are expectations that have been imprinted within us or created within us, or we've created within ourselves, that really are not doing us any favor. And so, I mean, is there ever a time where you can go without expectations? Or, I don't think that's the case. So then the question is, how are you able to look at these expectations and go, you know what, this is a healthy expectation. My goal and my expectation is I'm going to be successful, and this is a passion that I have, so I'm really going to move forward in that. And that expectation, I think, really helps to generate us in a certain direction. Other expectations end up being extremely unhealthy and causing all sorts of relationship problems, as well as our own personal situations. How do we determine the healthy versus the unhealthy ones? And how on earth do we start to at least minimize? I don't know that we can get rid of them. It would be nice if we could, but how do we minimize those expectations that really are not doing anything good for us?
Okay, so we're going to assume that the person wants to change, so we'll start there. Honestly, every time something comes up, there's an expectation behind it. There's no way around it. That's how we are as people. And it's really a question of, is this effective for me in getting what I want? Am I going to get to my dreams and goals and desires if I continue down this path with this expectation? Being a hateful person, if your goal is to truly hate and despise and alienate yourself from a lot of people, then that's an effective expectation of being prejudiced and hateful. If that's not what you want, if you want to actually trust the people you're around, then it might take effort on your part to change that expectation, to educate yourself, to do something different. And I think that's the biggest piece, is that we as individuals get to look at our own expectations and decide if they're effective or not in getting what we want. If they're effective in what we want, I would say they're a healthy expectation. If they're not getting us what we want, then they're probably an unhealthy expectation. And that's where we get to decide, okay, this isn't getting me what I want. Do I really want to keep thinking this way? Do I really want to keep this expectation as reality? And I think that's where education really comes in. And I'm not talking school. I'm not talking standard education. It's really stepping up and saying, I don't think what I just heard makes a lot of sense. Maybe I should explore this in a different avenue. Maybe there's other information that can help me change my mind. It's kind of weird, because I just saw somebody who was kind of going down the rabbit hole of the Flat Earth Society. He's like, why do flat earthers think what they think? And as he was kind of going through the process of learning what they were learning, he started to just slightly doubt himself on whether or not the earth is a sphere. And but it's kind of one of those things where you got to be careful about how you educate yourself, because there's plenty of information that'll lead you down a path that's not healthy at all. And there's other paths that are just great. But again, you have to really come back to, does this help get me what I want? And if it doesn't, it's time to explore it. And it's can be painful sometimes. It can be hard. But the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it, the more efficient you'll get at it, and the faster you'll move through them as time goes on.
Well, and I think you hit on a really important point. And that is looking at the outcome. What are we experiencing? What is the outcome of our life experiences right now? And then, look at that and go, do I like that? Is that what I'm hoping for? Or is this not the experience I want to have? And I think, as you say, the minute you look at what you're experiencing and go, this isn't what I want, that then becomes the initial thing to say, okay, I've got to go back and really look at what's going on. What are these expectations that I have that are not necessarily doing the right thing for me? Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. You look around at the people that, they'll go into a store and they'll bitch and complain to get their $5 back on something. They're not the ones getting their dreams. They're the ones that are fighting to, kind of keep things where they are and maybe get ahead by $5, or maybe get that free item because they complained about it. Maybe they'll get their dinner half price because they bitched and moaned about something that's irrelevant to life. The people that are out there, they're just always causing problems. They're always yelling at somebody because they never want to take responsibility for themselves. It's always somebody else's fault. And if that's the case, then they're never in control of their lives. They're never going to get what they want. And then there's other people who are like, you know what? I played my part. I did my, I didn't share my information, my expectations. I didn't do what I needed to do to make this happen for me. Now, what can I do? What can I shift? What can I change? What expectation can I explore, modify, look at differently to get what I want? Those are the people that are always getting what they want because they're always taking responsibility for their own actions.
All right, so let's look at an expectation that I come across with my kids, okay, and even to some degree myself, and I think it comes from my parents and on and on and on, and that's a sense of perfectionism. And I think that there are some personality types that actually have that happen more often than others do. But here's a child that's growing up and somehow they've developed, they sense this expectation of perfectionism. And then as they go on in life and as they go into adulthood, all of a sudden they find themselves under a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety because they're not perfect and they're not, accomplishing whatever they're doing, whether it's school or business or whatever. They're not accomplishing what they need to do. How do you suggest they are able to actually, first of all, identify, again, as we've talked about, all right, this is a little bit of perfectionism, but then how do they go in and start to modify that expectation and take it from an unhealthy level to a healthy level to where, yeah, you know what, I'm going to always do the best that I can, but at the same time, never put on that onerous situation and expectation of I've got to be perfect or I've got to do this better. What are your thoughts on that, parent?
Yeah, so I kind of grew up in the same world as you, so I totally understand. I would say if you find that perfectionism is hindering you in getting what you want, which it probably is because nothing's ever perfect, is start with little things that don't matter. If you're a perfectionist at cleaning, leave that corner a little dustier than you normally would. Just start cutting corners here and there. Leave things undone and say that's good enough. And you'll start to realize that the world didn't end. And then you can start moving that same process to bigger and bigger things. I wrote this book. Is it perfect? No. I'm sure if I went through and edited it again, I would change a bunch of things just because of all the interviews that I've done since writing it. But it was good enough. It got the point across. It's got the information that I wanted to get out there. And the thing is if I was going to be a perfectionist about it, I would still be writing that book. I would still be working on it. And maybe I fall over dead today. And now my book's never out there. It's not out there for the world to see. There was one interview where somebody asked, what do you want to accomplish before you die? And I was like, that's a great question to ask somebody. And I said, you know what? I've got my words on paper in books that are out there in the world. If I died tomorrow, I've at least created that will live on forever. It will always be out there, and it may change somebody's life in 5, 10, 20, 1,000 years. I don't know. But it's out there, and I can happily die knowing that it's out there. Now, again, I didn't make it perfect. It was perfect at the time. It was good enough at the time. and things can always be modified, changed, better. Anytime we start a job, we go into the job expecting to be perfect at it. Well, 10 years later, you're like, wow, I didn't know anything about that when I started. One of my businesses I looked at 10 years later, and I'm like, wow, I sucked back then. I'm way better now. And that's how it is. Through experience and time, we get better at what we do. Will we ever be perfect? No, because the world is never perfect. Things are always changing. So just start with the little things.
Yeah. And one of the things that you're doing as you're talking about that, which I think becomes key, is you're laughing. And I think having a sense of humor and being able to laugh at yourself and realize that, we're not perfect. And when we do things that screw up, guess what? We can just laugh at ourselves and realize we're not perfect. And I think if we start to do that, as you say, that literally we can start to minimize some of that. So
yeah, with that piece right there, that kind of brings up another thing is part of my background is doing improv. And there is no perfect improv. It's improv. You just do it. And I think that's another great way to get out of perfectionism is go take an improv class, learn what it's about, and, try it out, see what happens. And, you're not going to be perfect on stage, but you know what? You're going to survive and you're going to have fun and you're going to say it's okay not to be perfect.
And if you're going one direction because of your expectation and all of a sudden you hit a barrier, it's time to turn around and find a different way. And just hopefully, at least if you can't laugh at it, don't let it just drive you crazy.
Exactly. I laugh a lot more just because of my improv background. And, we live a life of improv. So you may as well learn the rules of improv because they apply to every moment of every day.
Let's talk about that for just a minute. When you talk about improv, and that's a very specific talent, I think, that one develops or one innately has. Obviously, you probably innately have had that. Let's talk about improv as it relates to life. What are your thoughts on that based on your experience in improv? How does it relate to life, and particularly for those right now that are really experiencing some tough times because of COVID, and whether that's affecting them from a family perspective or business perspective, income perspective? How do you develop, and what are really the key areas of improv that we can apply to our lives?
Yeah. So when I first thought about taking an improv class, I had those thoughts of I'm not good enough, smart enough, funny enough, fast enough, all the reasons why not. And then when I took my first improv class, the person said, there are rules to improv. You follow the rules, you'll be successful. And I was like, well, I can follow rules. That's easy. And it made improv the easiest thing ever. Just by following a very simple set of rules. My first book is actually called Living Unscripted. And I take 5 rules of improv, I apply them to everyday life. And that's my mantra. And what I've taken away from doing stage improv and how it applies to every moment of every day of my life. And I do have a lot more fun. I am a lot happier. And I do embrace change a lot easier because of my improv background. One of the things that you'll hear if you ever ask somebody, like, what are some rules of improv? The most common rule you'll ever hear is yes and. And the premise of yes and is accepting what is and moving on from there. On stage improv, it's a little bit more like accepting what's given to you and adding to the scene. If you think about expectations, somebody says, I need you to get this project to me by the end of today. I need you to finish the project by the end of today. Okay, I understand you want me to get you the project by the end of the day. And did you know that I'm working on these 4 other projects that are due at the end of the day? Do you want to prioritize them for me? Or, do you want me to just choose the priority for myself? That creates dialogue. That adds to the scene, as we are as humans. It adds to the conversation. It creates that level of communication. To basically say, I understand what you're saying. I understand the situation. And there's more information. That's where education comes in. That's where brainstorming comes in. It's like, yes, that's great. And what about this? And what about that? And have you thought about this? And et cetera, et cetera. there's an easy statement to really understand this concept, which is, I love you, but you're crazy. I love you and you're crazy. Which one sounds more positive?
Oh
I
yeah,
love you.
absolutely. The end.
Yeah, exactly. I love you and you're driving me nuts. I love you, but you're nuts. Like, that one's negative. That one, there's no love there because you just negated it with the word but.
Exactly.
And that's just kind of a downward spiral of who knows. But if it's, I love you, and okay, you can work from that. There's still love. You're driving me crazy. Let's talk about that. Let's move through it. And so improv, just learning the rules of improv, whether you take a class, whether you read a book, it's going to help frame the world a little bit differently, because you're going to see, something's not going right. Something's not working for me. I need to accept that that's what's happening before I can do anything else. Before I can move on, I have to accept that my finances are where they are. I have to accept that we're in a pandemic. I have to accept that I don't have the job that I want, that I don't have the friends that I want, that I don't have the relationship that I want, that I have a contentious situation with my kids. You have to accept what's happening at the moment before you're ever able to do anything else. And I mean, that's just any mental health expert's going to tell you that you got to start with acceptance.
And I think you've hit on a really key point in communication. Words make such a difference. And as you say, and that's one I think is really important. If we're communicating with someone and then we use the word but, we have just totally eliminated that first part of the communication, which may have been very positive. And whereas yes, and I love that concept. Now, as we come to the close, I'd love for you to share those other 4 improv steps that you say are really important that can be applied to life. Let's talk about them real quickly here. What are the other 4?
So yes, and in my book is rule number 2, actually, because I start with the first one of don't deny. And don't deny is more about that acceptance piece. And then the yes and comes in, because yes becomes the acceptance. But I think there's more depth around the don't deny piece, because it really just dives into accepting what is in the moment.
Okay, good.
Because once you've accepted it, then you can do the yes and, which is the and portion, what you're going to do about that particular moment in time. So don't deny, yes and. And another one is focus on the present. And, there's a book out there called The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, which is all about focusing on the present. You and I right now are focused on this interview here and now. If one of us was thinking about, okay, after this interview, I've got to go do this and I got to think about that. Oh, I forgot about that. If our minds are elsewhere, we're not going to have a very good conversation.
Right.
And I think anytime you're communicating with somebody, you have to be there, focused on the person, listening, hearing what they're saying, and having a conversation. Because if you're sitting there on your phone while you're talking, are you present? No, you're not. You're going to miss most of what's being said because it's not just words. And, from there, another rule that I discuss is be specific. And again, that comes back to those expectations of sharing exactly what you're thinking, giving specific information. Honey, I need you to take out the trash right now because I just threw fish guts in there and I don't want the house to smell when our guests come up. But that's way more specific than, honey, please take out the trash.
Good.
And so it's very important to add those specificities to our conversations. And then the 5th rule that I talk about is trust, which is not necessarily a rule. I mean, it is a rule, but it's also the result of following the other rules. And sometimes that's just trusting ourselves, not necessarily trusting others. But, there's so much level to the word trust. It's kind of crazy, but those are the 5 that I talk about in the book.
Well, and those are so applicable to life. And, I love it. I think that's so fantastic that you've come up with those. And as you say, they can be so applicable to life. So you've written a lot of books, haven't you? Or at least a few?
Yeah, a few. I think it's about 6 at this point. I've got another 8 on my board that I want to write.
Oh, wow. That is fantastic. I'm just struggling to write another one. And it's like, oh, that's so fun. But how do folks get a hold of your books?
I think the easiest way right now would be to go to havingexpectations.com. You can get the flow chart that I was talking about. You can get that for free. Put it on your fridge, put it at your place of business, whatever, just as a little quick reminder of it's okay to be upset as long as I do something about it. And you can find all the books listed there as well. And they're all on Amazon too. So.
Man, this has really been a great interview. I appreciate what you've been able to share with us today. I think it's fantastic and so applicable to us in our lives right now. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks again for having me.
Oh, you bet. And folks, thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed it. And we look forward to having you join us again soon.